A wife was dead in her own home. A stranger was dead in the same house. And the husband said he had walked in on a violent attack. At first, the story seemed to have a clear shape. A man had entered the Banfield home. Christine Banfield had been attacked. Her husband, Brendan Banfield, and the family's au pair, Juliana Peres Magalhães, said they had responded to a terrifying emergency. But the first version of the story would not be the last, because the man blamed for the violence, Joseph Ryan, was not simply a random intruder whose name appeared in a police report. His presence inside that house would become one of the biggest mysteries in the entire case. Why was he there? Who brought him into the story? And how did a scene that looked like self-defense become one of Virginia's most disturbing murder cases? The answers did not emerge all at once. They came piece by piece as investigators began looking beyond what happened inside the house that morning. Because to understand how two people ended up dead under the same roof, you have to go back to the secret that was already changing the Banfield family from within. Before the case became a headline, it was a house on a quiet street in Fairfax County, Virginia. A family home, a place with routines, work schedules, childcare, neighbors, and the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Brendan Banfield lived there with his wife, Christine Banfield, and their young daughter. From the outside, their life had the shape of stability: a married couple, a child, a home in Herndon, two adults with careers and responsibilities. Christine worked as a pediatric intensive care nurse. That detail matters because it tells you something about the kind of life she lived outside the headlines. Her work placed her around vulnerable children and families in crisis. It was demanding work, emotional work, work that required patience, discipline, and care. To the people who knew her, Christine was not just a name attached to a criminal case. She was a mother, a wife, a nurse, and a person with a life that had its own pattern before violence entered the story. Brendan Banfield had a very different professional background. He worked in federal law enforcement as an IRS criminal investigative agent. It was a role connected to investigation, procedure, and authority. He was not unfamiliar with investigations, evidence, or the way criminal cases are built. But at this point in the story, the Banfield home did not look like the beginning of a double homicide case. It looked like a household built around work, parenting, and everyday responsibilities. Then came Juliana Peres Magalhães. Juliana was a Brazilian au pair who came into the family's life to help care for Brendan and Christine's daughter. In many homes, an au pair becomes part of the daily rhythm quickly. She may help with childcare, meals, school routines, playtime, and the small practical tasks that keep a household moving. That kind of arrangement requires trust. A family opens its doors, a caregiver enters the private space of the home. Boundaries matter, roles matter. Everyone is supposed to understand why that person is there. Juliana was there to help care for the child, but somewhere inside that household, the boundaries changed. Brendan and Juliana became romantically involved. It was a relationship hidden inside the very home where Christine believed her family life was unfolding. An affair by itself does not explain what happened later. Relationships end, people betray each other. Most never become criminal cases. But in this story, the affair changed the emotional landscape inside the Banfield home. There was the visible version: Christine, Brendan, their daughter, and the au pair helping with family life. Then there was the hidden version: Brendan and Juliana building a relationship behind the surface of that same household. That is what makes this part of the story important. Not because the affair is shocking by itself, but because of where it happened and who was involved. This was not a distant relationship outside the family's orbit. It was not someone Brendan met completely separate from the home. Juliana was inside the family's daily life. She knew the routines. She knew the house. She knew the child. She was not outside the circle. She was already inside it. For Christine, the home should have been one of the safest places in her life. It was where her daughter lived. It was where she returned after work. It was where ordinary life was supposed to continue after long shifts and family responsibilities. From the street, the Banfield home still looked like any other suburban family home. Nothing about it suggested that loyalties inside had already begun to shift. And that is often what makes relationship-centered true crime cases so unsettling. The danger does not always arrive as a stranger. Sometimes it grows inside the relationships people trust most. Behind the quiet routine of the Banfield home, there was already a secret. But the secret affair was only one part of the story. The next piece came from outside the family entirely. Joseph Ryan was the one person who did not belong in the Banfield household. He was not Christine's husband. He was not the family's au pair. He was not part of their daily routine. He was a man from outside the home, outside the marriage, and outside the quiet suburban life that seemed to exist on that Fairfax County street. Yet on February 24th, 2023, Joseph Ryan ended up inside the Banfield house. That fact became one of the biggest questions in the entire case, because without Ryan, the first version of the story would have looked very different. His presence gave the scene a shape. It gave the emergency a person to point to. It made it possible for the morning to be described as something sudden, violent, and unexpected. But the question was never only what happened after Ryan entered the home. The question was why he came there in the first place. Online communications would later become important. Those communications were connected to activity on an adult fetish website, and they helped explain how a man with no known connection to the Banfield family ended up at their home. The details were sensitive, and they should be handled carefully. Joseph Ryan should not be reduced to a punchline or a stereotype. He was a person who walked into a home and never walked back out. The fact that the communications involved adult fetish-related activity does not change that. It does not make his death less serious. It does not make him less worthy of being treated with dignity. What matters is not the private nature of the website. What matters is how those communications functioned in the case. Someone believed they were arranging a meeting. Someone believed there was a reason to come to the Banfield home. What investigators would later uncover was that the identity behind those messages would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It would eventually reshape not only why Joseph Ryan came to the house, but who the jury believed had brought him there. That is where the story becomes more complicated. Because in the first account, Ryan was placed at the center of the danger. He was the stranger inside the house. He was the person whose presence seemed to explain why a husband and an au pair would respond with deadly force. For a story like that to make sense, Ryan had to be there. His presence turned the home from a private family space into the scene of a supposed attack. It gave Brendan and Juliana a reason to say they were reacting to something already happening. But even before the courtroom, there was an obvious question underneath that first version of events. Why would Joseph Ryan be inside that house at all? He did not live there. He was not a family friend. He was not part of Christine's nursing world. He was not connected to Brendan's professional life. He had arrived because someone had communicated with him beforehand. Exactly what Ryan believed was waiting for him inside that house would become one of the investigation's most important questions. That made the digital trail important. Messages, online profiles, and the identity behind those communications would eventually become central to understanding the case. Not because the subject matter was unusual, but because it helped answer the most basic question: who did Joseph Ryan believe he was communicating with? That question mattered because the first version of the story depended on Ryan appearing to be the source of the danger. If he had been invited under false pretenses, then his presence meant something very different. It meant he may not have been the cause of the chaos inside the house. He may have been used to create the appearance of it. At this point in the story, there were still many unanswered questions. The full picture had not yet been tested in court. The investigation had not publicly laid out every digital detail, and the people who survived that morning still had their own account of what happened. But Ryan's presence in the house was impossible to ignore. He was the outsider. He was the person whose name could make the first story sound believable. He was also the person who would never be able to explain what he thought he was walking into. That silence became part of the tragedy. Christine Banfield had a family, a career, and a life inside that home. Joseph Ryan entered that home from outside it. By the end of the morning, both were dead. And because Ryan was a stranger to the household, his presence created a kind of shortcut for suspicion. It was easy to look at the unfamiliar man and assume he must have been the threat. That is what made the first version of the story so powerful. The unfamiliar person becomes the obvious suspect. The familiar people become the witnesses. The home becomes the stage for a story that seems to explain itself before anyone has looked closely enough. But true crime cases are often built in the space between what first appears obvious and what later becomes undeniable. Joseph Ryan's presence was not a side detail. It was the hinge of the entire first narrative. Without him, there was no outsider to blame, no apparent intruder, no simple explanation for why gunshots were fired inside the Banfield home. With him, the scene could be framed around a violent encounter that Brendan and Juliana said they interrupted. That is why the online communications mattered. That is why the identity behind them mattered. And that is why the reason Joseph Ryan came to the Banfield home would eventually become central to the investigation. He arrived at the house believing he understood why he was there. Within minutes, he became part of a story he would never get to explain. If you're still watching this far into the story, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. Liking and subscribing is one of the easiest ways to support the work that goes into bringing these cases to life. On the morning of February 24th, 2023, the quiet routine of the Banfield home ended when Juliana Peres Magalhães called 911. Police were sent to a house in Herndon, Virginia, where Brendan Banfield lived with his wife, Christine, their young daughter, and the family's au pair, Juliana Peres Magalhães. By the time officers arrived, the home was no longer just a family residence, it was a crime scene. Christine Banfield was found critically injured inside the house. Joseph Ryan was also inside the home, suffering from gunshot wounds. Brendan and Juliana were the surviving adults tied to the scene, and the Banfield's 4-year-old daughter was inside the home. She was physically unharmed, but her presence would later become one of the reasons the case carried an additional criminal charge beyond the killings themselves. The first version of events gave the morning a simple explanation. Authorities were initially told that Joseph Ryan had attacked Christine. In that account, Brendan and Juliana were not presented as planners, but as people responding to a violent emergency. Ryan was the stranger inside the house. Christine was the wife under attack. Brendan was the husband who came upon the scene. Juliana was the au pair who became involved in the response. The early account placed Ryan at the center of the violence. That version mattered because it shaped the first way the case could be understood. If Ryan was the attacker, then the shootings could be framed as an attempt to stop him. If Brendan and Juliana believed Christine was in danger, their actions could be described as a reaction to a crisis already unfolding. On its surface, the story had a clear structure. A stranger enters the home, a wife is attacked, the husband and au pair respond. But from the very beginning, investigators faced a question they could not ignore. Did the physical evidence tell the same story as the people who survived? They had to do more than accept the shape of the story. They had to test it against the scene. They had to understand who called 911, when the calls were made, what was said, and whether the timing matched the physical evidence inside the home. They had to determine where each person was before the violence began. Where was Brendan? Where was Juliana? Where was Christine? Where was Joseph Ryan? Where was the child? Every position mattered, because in a case like this, the timeline is not just background, it is the spine of the investigation. A few minutes can change the meaning of everything. The house also had to be read carefully. A home can tell a story, but not always the one people first describe. Investigators had to look at entry points, movement through the rooms, the placement of bodies, the location of weapons, and whether the physical details supported the first version of events. They also had to confront the question that had been sitting underneath the case from the beginning. Why was Joseph Ryan there? He was not a neighbor who wandered in. He was not a friend stopping by. He was not a relative. He was a man from outside the household who had arrived there through circumstances that were not immediately obvious to anyone looking at the scene from the outside. His presence made the first account possible, but it also made the first account complicated. Because if Ryan was truly the attacker, investigators needed to understand how he got inside, why he came, and what connection brought him to Christine Banfield's bedroom that morning. If he was not the attacker, then his presence meant something far more calculated. But that question would take time. In the first hours, police had a dead man, a dying woman, 2 surviving adults, and a story of emergency self-defense. Christine was taken for medical help, but she did not survive. Joseph Ryan was already dead. The morning had left behind 2 victims and a version of events that seemed to explain their deaths, but only if every piece of that version held together. The 911 calls became part of that puzzle. Emergency calls often capture the first public version of a crisis. They can show panic, timing, urgency, confusion, and sometimes inconsistency. In this case, the calls were not just a record of help being requested. They became part of what investigators had to study to understand how the morning unfolded. The sequence mattered. Who called first? What was reported? What did the caller say was happening? How much time passed between one moment and the next? Those questions may sound procedural, but in a double homicide, procedure becomes the path to truth. The scene was first framed as an emergency response. But the more investigators examined the home, the people inside it, and the reason Joseph Ryan had come there, the more pressure gathered around that first account. There were relationships investigators had to understand. Christine was Brendan's wife. Juliana was the family's au pair. Brendan and Juliana were secretly involved. Joseph Ryan was the outsider whose presence appeared to explain the violence. Put those facts together too quickly, and the story becomes easy to oversimplify. Move too slowly, and the most important connections can be missed. That is why this morning became the turning point. Before February 24th, the Banfield home had secrets. After February 24th, those secrets had bodies attached to them. Christine Banfield was dead. Joseph Ryan was dead. And the people who survived were now connected by a version of events that investigators would have to measure against every call, every movement, every digital trace, and every physical detail inside the house. At first, the case appeared to have a simple shape: a husband, an au pair, and a violent stranger. But the closer investigators looked, the less simple that shape became. As investigators examined the crime scene, reconstructed the timeline, compared the physical evidence with the 911 calls, and analyzed digital records, the original account began to come under increasing pressure. The evidence was leading them somewhere very different from where the case had started. That last part mattered, because Brendan and Juliana were not just a husband and an au pair who happened to be in the same house that morning. They were romantically involved. Once investigators learned about the affair, the meaning of the household changed again. The relationship did not prove what happened inside the home, but it gave investigators a reason to look more closely at loyalty, motive, secrecy, and whether Brendan and Juliana's accounts truly fit together. One thing you'll notice across many of the relationship-centered cases we cover is that the most dangerous relationships rarely look dangerous from the outside. The warning signs usually only become clear in hindsight. That's exactly why I created the Hidden Red Flags Guide and Safety Clarity Toolkit, where I break down the patterns of manipulation, deception, control, and financial abuse that appear again and again across real cases like this. If you'd like to learn more, you'll find it linked below. The case was no longer only about a stranger in a bedroom. It was about the people who survived. It was about what they knew before Joseph Ryan arrived. It was about whether the scene matched the story they gave. Then investigators began following the digital trail that had brought Joseph Ryan to the Banfield home in the first place. They discovered that Ryan had not arrived by accident. Someone had been communicating with him online while posing as Christine Banfield. Investigators traced those communications to a fake profile created on the adult social networking site FetLife using Christine's identity. According to investigators, Ryan believed he had been invited to participate in a consensual sexual fantasy. Instead, he walked into a situation entirely different from the one he believed had been arranged. That discovery transformed one of the biggest unanswered questions in the case. Ryan was no longer simply the stranger found inside the house. Investigators now believed they understood why he had come there at all. The original account placed Ryan in the role of attacker. But if Ryan had been drawn to the house through deception, then his presence could mean something very different. It could mean the scene had been shaped before he ever walked through the door. That possibility changed the direction of the investigation. As investigators compared the digital evidence with the physical scene, they began questioning whether the violence had unfolded the way Brendan and Juliana first described. Evidence gathered during the investigation suggested the scene itself may have been manipulated after the killings to support the original self-defense account. That also gave new significance to the 911 calls. Investigators were no longer evaluating them simply as requests for emergency assistance. They were comparing what was reported with the timeline, the digital evidence, and the physical evidence inside the house to determine whether the first story accurately reflected what had happened. The case did not fully form in one instant. That matters, and it would be easy to tell the story as if investigators knew everything from the first day. But that is not how complex homicide investigations usually work. The first account gives police a starting point. The evidence either supports it, weakens it, or forces the investigation somewhere else. Here, the pressure built over time. Each new discovery changed the meaning of the one before it. The affair no longer looked like an isolated betrayal. Ryan's arrival no longer appeared random. The digital trail no longer supported a story of chance. Piece by piece, investigators began assembling a very different picture of what they believed had happened inside the Banfield home. The first major legal pressure did not fall on Brendan. In October 2023, it fell on Juliana. She was arrested and charged in connection with Joseph Ryan's death. She was no longer just the au pair who had survived the morning. She was now a defendant in a double homicide investigation. That changed everything. She now faced the possibility of years in prison. She also possessed information about what had happened inside the Banfield home, and before that morning ever began. Over time, her position shifted. Juliana eventually pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Joseph Ryan's death. As part of the legal process, she agreed to testify against Brendan. That decision became one of the most important turns in the case. It also became one of the most controversial, because Juliana was not an outside observer. She was involved, she was in the home, she had fired a weapon, she had been in a relationship with Brendan, and by the time she agreed to testify, she had a plea agreement that changed what she was facing. That meant her testimony would come with weight, but also with questions. The state would later present her as someone who could explain the alleged plan from the inside. The defense would later present her as someone with every reason to blame Brendan and protect herself. Both things mattered. A witness can be central and still be challenged. A plea agreement can produce important testimony, but it also gives the defense an obvious opening. Why should the jury believe someone who admitted her own role and stood to benefit from cooperating? That credibility fight would become a major part of the trial. But before the courtroom, the investigation still had to connect the pieces. Brendan was charged later. That order is important because it shows how the case developed. It was not simply a scene, an arrest, and a finished story. Authorities moved through months of interviews, digital evidence, forensic analysis, and legal pressure before Brendan Banfield became the central defendant. By then, the first version of events had been placed under enormous strain. The affair made the relationship between Brendan and Juliana impossible to treat as ordinary. The digital evidence made Joseph Ryan's arrival impossible to treat as random. The physical scene had to be measured against the original self-defense account. And Juliana's changing position meant the case now had a witness who claimed to know what happened before the violence ever began. Still, Brendan's defense team would not let that version stand unchallenged. His attorneys argued that investigators rushed toward one theory while overlooking evidence that pointed elsewhere. They challenged the digital evidence, disputed the prosecution's interpretation of the online communications, and argued that Juliana had a powerful incentive to reshape the story in a way that reduced her own responsibility. That is what made the case so difficult. It was not just about whether something looked suspicious. It was about whether the evidence could prove that the first story was false. Investigators had moved far beyond the first emergency call. They were no longer only asking what happened inside the bedroom that morning. They were asking who created the conditions that brought Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan into that same deadly moment. The case had started with a claim of self-defense. It had become a question of planning. And once Juliana agreed to testify, the investigation moved into its final phase. By the time Brendan Banfield's case reached trial, the question was no longer simply what happened inside the Banfield home on February 24th, 2023. The question was which version of that morning the evidence supported. In one version, Brendan Banfield was a husband who rushed home after receiving a call from the family's au pair, walked into a violent attack on his wife, and fired to save her. In the other, he had not interrupted the violence. He had helped create it. That was the case the prosecution presented to the jury. Prosecutors argued that Brendan conspired with Juliana Peres Magalhães to murder Christine Banfield and used Joseph Ryan as the person who would take the blame. The digital trail investigators had spent months assembling now became one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. Jurors heard how a fake FetLife profile created in Christine Banfield's name had been used to communicate with Joseph Ryan and lure him to the Banfield home. According to prosecutors, Ryan believed he was arriving for a consensual adult fantasy. Instead, they argued he had been drawn into a deadly trap. The prosecution's theory turned the entire first story upside down. Joseph Ryan was no longer presented as the attacker. He became another victim. According to prosecutors, what happened after Ryan entered the house was the heart of the conspiracy. They alleged that Brendan shot Ryan before fatally stabbing Christine with the knife Ryan had unknowingly brought to the house. They further argued that when Ryan was still moving, Juliana fired another shot that killed him. According to the state, the scene was then manipulated, including transferring Christine's blood onto Ryan to support the appearance of a violent home invasion and justify the shootings as self-defense. The affair also returned to the center of the case. By trial, it was no longer simply evidence of betrayal. Prosecutors used it as part of their motive theory, arguing that Brendan wanted to preserve his relationship with Juliana while avoiding the consequences of divorce, custody disputes, financial loss, and public exposure. That was the prosecution's picture. A secret affair, a digital catfishing scheme, a stranger drawn to the house, a wife killed, a crime scene allegedly staged to make that stranger appear responsible. But the case did not rest on theory alone. Juliana became the witness who described the alleged plan from the inside. After pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter in Joseph Ryan's death, she testified for the prosecution over the course of 3 days, describing the affair, the planning, and what she said happened inside the Banfield home. Her testimony became one of the prosecution's most important pieces of evidence because she claimed to have witnessed the alleged plan from the inside. But she was also the witness the defense attacked most aggressively. She had been Brendan's secret lover. She had fired the fatal second shot that killed Joseph Ryan. She had accepted a plea agreement. The defense argued those facts gave her every reason to shift responsibility away from herself. To Brendan's attorneys, Juliana was not revealing the truth. She was protecting her future. That credibility battle became one of the central issues for the jury. Then Brendan made a decision that surprised many observers. Unlike many defendants in murder trials, he took the witness stand in his own defense. He admitted to the affair with Juliana, but insisted he still loved Christine and never wanted his marriage to end. He testified that Juliana called him that morning to report a stranger inside the house, and when he arrived, he found Joseph Ryan attacking Christine with a knife. According to Brendan, Christine cried out, "Brendan, he has a knife!" and he fired only to save her life. He also denied knowing anything about the fake FetLife profile or the messages used to lure Ryan to the house, calling the prosecution's conspiracy theory absolutely crazy. Prosecutors also confronted Brendan with a 14-page jailhouse letter he had written to Juliana after their arrests. In it, he described himself as obsessed with her happiness, wrote that he had never had a consistent partner before, and repeatedly referred to Juliana as a hero. The state argued the letter revealed the depth of their relationship and stood in sharp contrast to Brendan's claim that he had never wanted to lose his wife. When questioned about those statements, Brendan acknowledged writing the letter, but testified that he called Juliana a hero because he genuinely believed she had saved his life from Joseph Ryan that morning. He maintained that despite the affair, he had loved Christine and never wanted her dead. The prosecution challenged that account. Rather than asking jurors to focus on any single piece of evidence, prosecutors urged them to consider how everything fit together. They argued that the affair, the fake online identity, the digital communications, the physical evidence inside the house, and the inconsistencies in Brendan's account all pointed toward the same conclusion. The scene had been manipulated to support a version of events that never actually happened. The state also reminded jurors that Brendan had spent years working in federal law enforcement. According to prosecutors, he understood investigations, crime scenes, and the importance of shaping the first narrative police would hear. The defense rejected that interpretation. They argued the prosecution was asking jurors to fill gaps with speculation. They maintained that the state had failed to prove a conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, and that Brendan had acted in defense of his wife during a terrifying emergency. For nearly 4 weeks, the jury heard those competing stories. One side said Brendan Banfield responded to a crisis. The other said he carefully built one. Then the case went to the jury. On February 2nd, 2026, after nearly 9 hours of deliberation, a Fairfax County jury found Brendan Banfield guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, and 1 count of child endangerment. At that moment, the language changed. He was no longer only accused, he was convicted. The jury rejected the self-defense account that had framed the case from the very beginning. Juliana's case ended differently, but not without consequences. After pleading guilty to involuntary manslaughter and testifying against Brendan, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Despite prosecutors recommending a lighter sentence because of her cooperation, the judge concluded that her role in Joseph Ryan's death still demanded significant punishment. Then came Brendan's sentencing. On June 5, 2026, Judge Penny Asgarat described the conspiracy as evil before imposing consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the court's conclusion that the killings had not been a spontaneous act of self-defense, but the result of a deliberate and carefully orchestrated plan. The punishment reflected what the court concluded had happened. 2 people had been killed. A 4-year-old child had been inside the home while the violence unfolded upstairs, and an elaborate plan had ended with 2 families forever changed. For Christine's family, no sentence could restore the life they lost. For Joseph Ryan's family, no verdict could give him the chance to explain why he believed he had been invited to that house. And for the Banfield's young daughter, the consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. She lost her mother. She lost her father to prison. The adults responsible for protecting her home became the people who destroyed it. The courtroom delivered its verdict, but no verdict could ever restore the lives that were lost inside the Banfield home. The Brendan Banfield case is not simply about a secret affair. It is about what can happen when betrayal crosses the line into calculated violence. Christine Banfield was killed inside the home where she should have been safest. She was a wife, a mother, and a pediatric intensive care nurse whose life became part of a criminal investigation long before it became part of a courtroom record. Joseph Ryan was drawn to the Banfield home under circumstances he did not fully understand. He never had the chance to explain why he believed he had been invited there. Christine Banfield was more than a victim. Joseph Ryan was more than the stranger at the center of the first story. Both were real people whose lives became evidence after they were gone. This case also reminds us why first impressions can be so dangerous. A crime scene can be staged, a story can be rehearsed, someone can sound convincing in the moments after violence, but evidence has a way of revealing what even the most carefully constructed story cannot hide forever. If you found this case insightful, let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries built on verified facts and courtroom evidence, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one.